Hello everyone, and welcome to another complimentary Green Tech Media webinar. Today's presentation, Building Blocks to a Successful Non-Wires Alternative Strategy, is brought to you with support from our sponsor, Converge. I'm Elta Colo, an analyst for GTM Research, a Green Tech Media company, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Green Tech Media is an online publisher for information in the green and renewable technology industry. GTM Research is the market analysis and consulting arm of Green Tech Media. You can stay informed by reading the news on greentechmedia.com and find out more about our research products by visiting gtmresearch.com. You can also click the GTM icon at the bottom of your screen for more information about our company. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to go over the screen in front of you, so that you can make the most of the time we have with our speakers. You'll notice there's a dock along the bottom of your screen with several widgets. Some widgets may be of interest. Download Slides has a link to download a PDF of this presentation. On the right side of your menu bar, you can find speaker bios. There's also a widget that allows you to share this webinar through your preferred social media outlets. Please note that you are able to enter questions at any point throughout the presentation through the Q&A box located on the lower left-hand side of your screen. We will have a 10 to 15-minute question and answer segment at the end of the presentation today, during which we will try to address all of your questions. To enlarge the slide area, just click on the box on the top right corner of the presentation window. Before we go any further, I would like to introduce you to today's speakers. Matt McCaffrey, Senior Director of Regulatory Strategy at Converge, and Mark Sclafani, Senior Program Coordinator of Demand Response at Central Hudson Gas and Electric. Today's presentation will be broken into 4 parts. GTM Research will give a brief overview of the utility demand response landscape. Following, Matt McCaffrey will speak about the evolving regulatory landscape for non-wires alternatives. And after, Mark Sclafani will speak about Central Hudson's non-wires alternative. We will conclude with a 10 to 15-minute audience Q&A session at the end of the hour. To participate in the Q&A period, you can enter that at any time via the Q&A dialog box on the left of your screen. The utility demand response in the U.S. power system. When looking at the 2015 figures of available demand response in the U.S. power system, the Energy Information Administration reports that there were nearly 32.9 gigawatts of utility demand response available. Although there is the capability of almost 33 gigawatts of flexibility, on average, only about 1/3 of this total demand response gets used. More than 50% of the available demand response comes from industrial customers, followed by residential and commercial customers. Total incentives to customers last year exceeded $1.1 billion to more than 9.1 million customers.
That's enough for 60 presents.
Average annual savings per industrial customer were over $7,000, down nearly $2,000 from the previous year. Commercial customers averaged $380 per customer, down more than $200 per customer from 2014. In the residential sector, customer incentives averaged $39 per customer, about the same as the previous year. When taking a closer look at where this demand response is coming from, we see that nearly 65% of the total demand response capacity is held by less than 20 utilities across the country, with 14 of those gigawatts held by 4 entities alone, which are concentrated in territories with summer peaking systems. Traditionally, there have been 2 overarching ways for utilities and aggregators to work together in gathering demand response flexibility. In territories where there is an independent system operator or regional transmission organization, aggregators can act as brokers for the customer with demand response and bid their individual or aggregate flexibility of multiple customers into the ISO, energy, ancillary services, and capacity markets. Differently, aggregators of demand response can work with utilities to establish and even manage demand response flexibility programs for various needs of a utility. As business models evolve, there's momentum building to look at demand-side resources as cheaper alternatives to large infrastructure upgrades, making use of targeted demand response and other distributed energy resources as non-wires alternatives, which aim to defer the cost of expensive grid equipment such as conductors, transformers, and substations, and use demand-side resources in those pockets instead. Some noteworthy efforts include those of California, where in addition to California's 1.3 gigawatts of energy storage mandate, investor-owned utilities in the state have pursued non-wires alternatives through a number of projects, including Pacific Gas and Electric's targeted demand-side management for distribution program at 8 different substations, and Southern California Edison's and San Diego Gas and Electric's preferred resources pilots for local capacity requirements. In addition, the California investor-owned utilities are contracting for distributed energy resources through the demand response auction mechanism. In the Northeast, National Grid has pursued non-wires alternatives in 2 areas, while the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection ran an RFP for small-scale clean energy projects, including energy efficiency and energy storage. In New York, several utilities have issued non-wires alternatives RFPs and RFIs to address capacity constraints on their networks in accordance with reforming the energy vision. Our speakers will tell us more about these initiatives in New York in the remainder of the webinar. Prior to starting the speaker presentations, I would like to pose a question to the audience. Is your utility or utility you work with considering a non-wires alternatives project? You can answer yes, it's in the early stages. Yes, preparing an RFP or an RFI. Yes, currently being implemented, or no. So I will pause for a couple of seconds here in order to get everybody's answers in, and then I will post the results. So as we can see here, most of you said yes in the early planning stages, and followed by simply no with a close third, yes, currently being implemented. I will now hand it off to Matt McCaffrey, the Senior Director of Regulatory Strategy at Converge.
Thank you, Elta, and thanks to GTM for hosting us today on this webinar, and especially for all of you who are taking time out of your busy day to listen in. My name is Matt McCaffrey, and I direct regulatory strategy for Converge at the state, RTO, and federal levels. And today I wanted to give you more of a vendor's perspective to some of the enabling regulatory policies for geo-targeted programs like non-wire alternatives, and talk about how some of the barriers presented by the traditional cost of service model can be overcome before I turn it over to Mark and he talks at a more program-specific level about what they're doing at Central Hudson. But first, I wanted to briefly introduce Converge to those of you who may not be familiar with us. We're the largest mass market demand response company in the country, and one of the longest running demand response companies around today, regardless of sector. Our software platform and programs focus on device-enabled energy management for residential and small commercial customers. And we work directly through utility partners across the country to manage about 6,200 megawatts of peak. We've deployed over 6 million devices throughout our history and currently have over 2 million end users enrolled in our program. Throughout the company's history, we've seen a lot of changes in the landscape, whether that's regulatory policies, generation and fuel switching, utility priorities, customer expectations, and of course, technology. And in anticipating those changes over the years, the challenge for us has been to innovate ahead of the curve and offer solutions that help both utilities and their customers. And that's really the crux of what I wanted to talk about today, given the current landscape. Now, this shifting landscape in all senses, end-use demand and changes at the grid edge, are being addressed through regulatory policy to enable alternative investments to traditional transmission and distribution infrastructure. But first, before I get into that, I wanted to get an impression on the use of non-wire alternatives. And if you don't mind responding to another quick poll, I want to get an idea of some of the perspectives out there on the line. So just reading through the question, in what situations do you consider non-wire alternatives as a cheap and reliable substitute for large infrastructure upgrades for a utility. To defer transmission scale grid upgrades, yes. To defer distribution scale grid upgrades. To defer both transmission and distribution scale upgrades. Or yes, in very scenarios like remote grid strengthening, for example. Or the last option being never. I'll give you a few, actually, I'll go back real quickly and give you guys a few more seconds to respond. And now we'll take a look at the answers. It looks like the overwhelming response to defer both transmission and distribution scale upgrades. And it looks like there's 3.1% of you out there I'd like to convince otherwise over the next few minutes. So before I get into some of the specifics of non-wire alternatives, I wanted to offer a little bit of context into what we're trying to change and what we're exploring here. So Alfred Kahn, the great economist who literally wrote the book on rate regulation, was once reflecting on one of his decisions when he served as chair of the New York Commission. Now, this was for a telecom case, but the sentiment still applies today. And his desire was to, quote, get the regulators out of the way so that competition would reduce prices and save consumers money. That's obviously something a lot of us can get behind and has been a central tenet for several grid modernization efforts across the country. But regulation will continue to play a critical role in creating a more dynamic grid, and utility distribution planning will continue to be an important, if not the most important, piece of the puzzle as we move to this grid future. So going back to Utility Regulation 101 for a minute, let's not overlook the stability of the regulatory model. Whether we're talking about NWAs or DERs, we're really talking about changing how we price the one thing that our economy needs every minute of every day. We don't really have the luxury of creative destruction when it comes to investment and pricing that we see in competitive markets, and any changes need to be carefully considered. And historically, adherence to rate-based eligibility rules has allowed for utilities to be successful businesses and attractive targets for capital, allowed for prudent review of those investments and for the cost-effective expansion of service across the country for the past 100-plus years. And for me, no other data communicate this more effectively than the stability of real electricity prices over the past several decades. But in today's changing world, a conservative cost-of-service regulatory model is frankly insufficient to address the current dynamic. Adding rate-based to the traditional pool of poles and wires investments, utilities will continue to have incentive to invest in technologies and platforms that allow for distributed energy resources to be fully integrated in the grid in a way that benefits all consumers, not just certain customer segments and classes. It also prevents utilities from either pursuing innovation in-house or becoming incubators and practitioners of innovation by working with third-party providers. And from our perspective, one of the biggest challenges utilities and regulators have to face is the need for more localized solutions. And these changes are being driven in parallel on both the utility side and the consumer side more today than ever before. By no means is this limited to the challenge of the increases in distributed generation. While solar panels may be the most visible representation of distributed energy resources, or DERs, there's a whole other complementary class of resources that are helping address locational issues with a focus on energy management to balance out some of those generation resources. In other words, the regulatory treatment of DERs is not just about how generation can impact the grid, but how energy management technologies can benefit it. And to talk about the grid edge, particularly in the highly fragmented mass market that Converge plays in, you need to address locational value. So looking at some national trends, there are some really distinct drivers for localized solutions. Over the past several years, we've seen low to flat growth in demand, but due to a population growth trend towards more centralized locations, urban, suburban, and some exurban areas, we're also seeing peakier demand in specific locations. And as I just mentioned, we're also seeing more distributed generation on the grid, as everyone knows. Customer expectations are also changing. They're demanding more choices, quicker engagement, and more control. And unfortunately, we're also seeing that RTOs are unsuitable parties for extracting value, even for system-wide solutions on the energy management side. And this is especially true when thinking about solutions at the subzonal level, as we're doing today. So fortunately, we've seen significant momentum behind grid modernization or utility of the future policies. Building on Elta's slide from earlier, here's a quick representation of the states that are either actively pursuing these programs or are investigating it. But this map doesn't really tell the whole story. There's a widening gap between the leaders and those still finding their way. New York and California are on the bleeding edge, not necessarily the leading edge, which is not atypical for either state, especially when it comes to demand-side management, energy management policy. But unlike other DSM policies, the fast follower states aren't really following as quickly when it comes to grid modernization. And there's a lot of justified apprehension over grid modernization and how to integrate a rate structure that properly values distributed energy resources and addresses these locational challenges. And what this indicates for us is that there's a clear need to unpack some of these grid modernization programs and policies, since they're so big and, when taken on the whole, very resource intensive, and sometimes prohibitively so. The states that have moved into the lead should certainly be commended. But we also need to recognize that most states might not have the resources or political will to dedicate to wholesale regulatory change. Now, fortunately, there's a spectrum for addressing the core objectives of grid modernization, which are a more flexible two-way grid that assigns values to elements and resources at the grid edge. And this localized value is what non-wire alternatives seek to address. So, as a quick caveat, I will be and have been using non-wire alternatives, load pockets, and targeted demand management fairly interchangeably. They all speak to programs that help a utility or community address constraints on their system through intelligent energy and grid management as an alternative to traditional infrastructure investments. And even though we're historically a demand response company, Converge is, and demand response plays an important role in targeted demand management, it's by no means the only component. These programs combine peak reduction, energy balancing, energy efficiency, and customer engagement to defer these traditional investments in a cost-effective manner. So I wanted to include this slide, not to go over each aspect of the model. Mark will cover the details of their program in a few minutes, which I think will be far more useful to you, the listeners. But I wanted to relay that even though the objectives of these programs are fairly simple and easy to communicate, the programs themselves are incredibly complex. As I said, this isn't just demand response, but a stacked program of energy management, face-to-face interactions with the customer, promotion of existing programs, etc. And given the complexity, part of the reason that utilities and third parties need regulatory certainty is to, for one, provide necessary oversight so that they're properly executed in the interest of the consumer and in the interest of long-term sustainability of these programs. And secondly, to provide more long-term certainty to the stakeholders. And from a vendor perspective, to the investments that we make in innovations within these programs. So far I've been speaking very generally about the enabling policies. But I wanted to, before I hand it over to Mark, I wanted to talk about some of the specific emerging best practices and policies already in place that could easily be spread to other jurisdictions or adapted to encourage further non-wire alternative investment. So I spoke earlier about unpacking grid modernization efforts, and we've done that a bit internally. In doing so, we've found that one of the common characteristics across those states that could easily be extracted and implemented in other jurisdictions is to have a mechanism that increases transparency into utility investment decisions in their distribution systems. Thus far, it's been a very opaque process, And there have been some good reasons for that, and some of it's just been tradition. But these programs, these policies known as distribution system implementation plans, gives the utilities an opportunity to address local congestion and increasing or unpredictable demand in their service territories through distributed energy resources and the accompanying demand management system, rather than more substations and wires. New York, of course, has this in place, and Maryland recently opened a proceeding to investigate implementation of distribution system implementation plans for their utilities, and we hope to see more states following suit. It doesn't require wholesale regulatory change, and out of the different options, it's one of the easier ones to implement. Secondly, we think that there should be policies that act to protect the utility and its consumers by having some sort of performance requirement for third parties, and thus add some reassurance to balance out non-wireless alternatives versus the certainty of traditional infrastructure investments. To put it simply, if a non-wire alternative does not perform, the result is expensive at best and dangerous at worst. By having a mechanism that addresses or requires accountability of the third party to perform, that entity now has significant skin in the game. Plus, it makes it much easier to make the jump from pilot to program, which from our perspective and from a lot of utilities' perspectives, it's sometimes the biggest gap to cross. Converge offers a pay-for-performance model, which is exactly what it sounds like. We appreciate what's at stake for our utility partners, so if we don't deliver the megawatts that we've committed to, we don't get paid. We feel that this is the most effective way to address accountability on our end. But if there are alternatives and suggestions for alternatives, I certainly look forward to your questions. Finally, there's a question of value for compensation, and this is really one of the biggest questions out there. NARUC recently published their DER compensation manual, which was released at the NARUC annual meeting earlier this month. And there are a lot of jurisdictions out there struggling with this. But really, if you take a step back, so far what we've seen is keeping with the core tenets of the Federal Power Act when it comes to value. So we've seen compensation models that are either market-based or cost-based. And one thing that's been clear, regardless of the approach, is that the focus for any of these programs need to be on program objectives and not on a specific technology or solution. Doing so opens the door to more innovative solutions that one might not see otherwise. It fosters competition and it avoids picking winners. But back to the value question. For the market-based approach, we've seen a couple of auctions for DER deployment and specifically for targeted demand management. And the main advantage of this, of course, is that there's an inherent incentive for third parties to competitively price their platforms. But the main issue from our side is that it does not incent investment over about a 2-year to 3-year window. Well, like I pointed out in the previous slide, these are very complex programs with a lot of moving parts. And the main objectives, just like planning a new substation, are over a long-term horizon. And this is the main reason that we think cost-based approaches are better. Fortunately, there are existing and proven models that can be adapted to ensure that the utility can make this a sustainable part of their business. So going back to the traditional regulatory model from the first couple of slides, the simplest way to address the disincentive to invest in non-traditional infrastructure is to include specific technologies and solutions as eligible for rate base, just expanding rate base one step further. The most direct example of this is the proceeding in Illinois that looks to include cloud-based solutions in rate base, which was recently backed up by a NARUC resolution at the annual meeting. This is admittedly, it's a simple approach, but it's admittedly more of a piecemeal approach that would likely need to be revisited for each new technology or solution that is deemed important for the consumer and for the utility. So 2 potential policies that we've not yet seen for non-wire alternatives, but that have been used to incent demand-side management for many years are an ROE kicker, where the utility receives an extra few basis points on their authorized ROE for hitting or exceeding their target, or recovery of a percentage of the total program cost, again, which is awarded when the utility hits or exceeds the program targets. Like I said, we've not seen these applied for NWA compensation, but the template exists through the many DSM programs across the country, particularly for the latter example, the percentage of program cost model, and we think that it could easily be adapted to compensate investment in non-wire alternatives. Finally, and Mark will go into detail on the specifics of this in New York, there's the shared savings model. In a lot of ways, this one makes the most sense for non-wire alternatives because compensation is directly tied to avoided cost, which is one of the primary objectives of these programs. So under shared savings, the utility earns a percentage of the difference between the amount they would have spent on traditional infrastructure and the actual expenditure on the non-wire alternative program. This way, with increased savings to the consumer and a return on the utility's investment, the benefit is shared. And this is about a perfect time to transition over to Mark to speak to the details of their model and their program, rather. But before he does, I just want to end by saying that we've gotten a lot of interest from utilities around the country that are interested in running programs, interested in running a non-wire alternative. They have the same constraints and face similar challenges that Central Hudson does, but a lot of them are unable to move forward because they don't have a way to make this a part of their business, a sustainable part of their business. They can't justify the expense. And even if it makes sense on every other level, they still can't do it because of regulatory barriers. And this is why it's so important that we push these regulatory changes forward prudently to make this a sustainable long-term part of utility investment and foster further innovation. So with that, I'll end, and thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Matt. I'm Mark Sclafani, Senior Program Coordinator of Demand Response Programs at Central Hudson. And today I'm going to spend a little time walking through Central Hudson's experience with our first non-wires alternative project and some of the regulatory frameworks that are in existence in New York State. Let's start with a brief overview of Central Hudson Gas and Electric. We're a relatively small utility providing gas and electric service to 8 counties throughout the Hudson River Valley, which is located between the New York City metropolitan area and the Albany capital region. We cover an area of 2,600 square miles and serve approximately 300,000 electric customers and 78,000 gas customers. Central Hudson has been serving the Hudson Valley for over 100 years. The company was recently acquired by Fortis in 2013, Fortis's first acquisition in the U.S. Fortis now has 10 utility and other energy holdings throughout the U.S., Canada, and the Caribbean. Now I'd like to spend a little time discussing an important initiative which is transforming the electric distribution industry in New York State. Reforming the Energy Vision, better known as REV, is the main catalyst for Central Hudson's non-wires alternative, as well as several other DER projects implemented by utilities in New York. The essential purposes of REV are to create a more efficient and resilient energy system, empower New Yorkers to make more informed energy choices, and to create an environment which facilitates greater utilization of DERs to meet the needs of the electric system. Some of REV's specific policy goals are to increase customer knowledge and tools to aid energy bill management, animate new and existing markets and better leverage ratepayer contributions, improve system efficiency, reliability, and resiliency, and increase fuel and resource diversity, all while reducing cost to consumers. REV also has some key carbon emission reduction goals. The proceeding aims to achieve a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 levels, procure 50% of New York's generation from renewable resources, and decrease the energy consumption of buildings 23% from 2012 levels. REV has also given utilities a special focus on peak demand management as a way to support these goals. Now let's investigate Central Hudson's historical peak load profile. Central Hudson is a summer peaking utility, with peaks typically occurring in July or August on non-holiday weekdays. This chart shows Central Hudson's annual peak system load over the past 10 years. What we see is a significant negative growth trend of approximately 1.4% per year, primarily due to the economic decline that has occurred in the Hudson Valley. Energy efficiency has also had a minor contribution to this trend. As a result, Central Hudson's system-wide load serving capacity well exceeds the current demand needs of the system. So why does Central Hudson need to manage peak demand? Although Central Hudson does not have significant system-wide capacity constraints, approximately 5% of our capital budget is still related to load growth, which is occurring in certain pockets throughout the service territory. We've identified 3 such areas in which growth is forecasted to require major infrastructure upgrades within the next 5 to 10 years. The first is a 115 kV transmission rebuild in what we refer to as the northwest area towards the top of the map. The second is a new substation in the Fishkill area on the lower right. And the third is an upgrade to 2 distribution feeders out of our Merritt Park substation in the far south. Through a non-wires alternative, Central Hudson plans to offset the forecasted capacity growth in these areas, successfully deferring each of these infrastructure projects. The need for this infrastructure will not be obviated entirely. Central Hudson has designed the non-wires alternative to defer these projects an additional 10 years into the future. This deferral will still result in significant benefits for the company and its customers. To sufficiently reduce the localized capacity needs for infrastructure deferral, specific program targets must be met. Throughout the 3 areas, Central Hudson needs to acquire a total of 16 megawatts of capacity by 2019. These 3 areas are mainly suburban and rural, made up primarily of residential customers. There are also a small number of commercial and industrial customers, but not enough to support a solution targeted only to that population. This makeup factored heavily into our selection process. After a competitive solicitation which included various vendors representing a wide range of technologies, Central Hudson selected to partner with Converge for a targeted demand response solution, which we've branded Peak Perks. The program incorporates direct control units, or DCUs, and telemetry-enabled thermostats deployed throughout the targeted areas to cycle central air conditioners and pool pumps in times of capacity need. Participating customers receive a Wi-Fi enabled thermostat, or DCU if they prefer, and free installation of their device. Residential customers receive incentives of $85 per device at sign-up and $50 per year thereafter. Approximately 50% higher incentives are available for small commercial customers. Curtailment incentives are also available for large C&I customers, paid at a rate of approximately $25 per season for each kilowatt of reliable curtailment provided. So where are we today? Since the program launched on April 1st, we have over 1,650 connected devices deployed in the field. In the Fishkill area, where we have focused the bulk of our resources, 25% of customers with central air conditioning are already participants in the program, which is an excellent adoption rate for the first program year. We also have 5 commercial and industrial participants scattered throughout the 3 program areas. Based on the year-to-date results, we are on track to meet our 2016 planning milestones. By implementing this non-wires alternative, the company has foregone the ability to earn a return on traditional capital infrastructure expenditures that would have otherwise occurred. So how does the company benefit? A new earnings mechanism was recently approved by the Public Service Commission. First, the financial benefits of the non-wires alternative solution are determined. The benefits calculation includes the estimated cost of the traditional transmission or distribution infrastructure, the actual cost to implement the targeted demand response alternative, and the capacity savings achieved by the program. The benefits are then shared between Central Hudson and its customers. Under this mechanism, Central Hudson will earn 30% of the financial benefits of the program. The remaining 70% creates natural rate moderation to utility customers. Central Hudson made a decision early on in the process to partner with a third party for several reasons. Central Hudson is new to demand response and using DERs to manage peak load in general. We were looking for a partner with extensive experience in demand response to give our program the best chance of success. It also fits well into our overall resource strategy. Our small energy efficiency and demand response team relies heavily on the support of program partners to effectively manage 19 programs. There are several key areas of support that our partner is providing for this non-wires alternative. We have access to Converge's IntelliSource DRMS software, which is very valuable to us in terms of program tracking and event dispatch. Converge's field operations staff support the device installations. We also have a dedicated door-to-door sales team to maximize awareness and participation. Converge's marketing team and customer service personnel also support the program, which shifts a significant burden off of our internal customer service staff. It was critical for us to launch the program quickly to achieve our time-sensitive program milestones. The program targets are also fairly aggressive, as we forecast that over 50% of the eligible customers will need to participate to make the program successful. This is a very high adoption rate, even for a mature program. Without the support of a partner, it would have taken Central Hudson significantly longer to facilitate the program launch and made it much more challenging to have a successful program. Based on the early success of the program, we believe we are in a good position to meet the 2019 program targets and create a new earnings opportunity for the company while supporting the goals of REV in New York State. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and I'm going to turn it back over to Elta.
Okay, so now let's move on to the Q&A section. Thank you very much, Matt and Mark, for your presentation. We had plenty of questions come in, but I'd like to remind everyone that you can still submit questions using the Q&A module. So the first question I'm going to ask here is to you, Mark. So what have been the stakeholder hurdles to approve New York performance incentives?
Well, as far as approving performance incentives in New York State, there's been a long road to develop that, and I think that each solution for each utility is kind of unique. Central Hudson has been working with the Department of Public Service for the last year or so to determine a solution that works for us and ratepayers, and it may be different for other utilities in the state, such as Con Edison, that are also implementing projects.
Okay, great. And just another question that came in about your sharing of savings. How was the 70-30 split for the Central Hudson program? How did you come to that?
The 70-30 split was determined by the Public Service Commission. Central Hudson originally had petitioned for a 50-50 split, and the resulting program ended up being 70-30, which we're still very happy with.
Okay, great. And can you discuss how Central Hudson is incentivized via performance benchmarks?
Can you just clarify what you mean by performance benchmarks?
What kind of benchmarks has the regulatory authority set for you guys?
So the way that our performance is being measured, the overall target of the program by 2019 is 16 megawatts. So it's sort of aggregated, and we have two regulatory milestones, one at when we achieve 8 megawatts of capacity, and the other final milestone when we achieve the 16 megawatts. And what we're doing is providing regular reports to DPS staff that are showing our calculations of capacity that's reduced, and it's consistent with most of the NISO protocols for measurement and verification of DR. Okay, great. And I think this is a question that either of you can answer. Why should a utility receive any ratepayer-funded incentives to do demand response programs instead of wires? And maybe we can get both Mark and Matt to speak to this.
Well, sure. I'll give Mark a break real quickly. This is so I think that really, when you look at the regulatory compact, the regulatory compact really speaks to nothing about the investments that need to take place in order to maintain an adequate level of service. So it's really about the level of service that the utility provides to its customer, and that it does so in a cost-effective manner. Now, if you have a targeted demand management solution that passes all of the cost-effectiveness tests and is in fact more cost-effective than traditional infrastructure, as is the case with Central Hudson, and provides the same type of reliability and service, then my perspective is that it certainly should be eligible, an eligible investment for a return. Otherwise, if it doesn't have the same opportunity to earn a return for the company that's investing in it and the company that's dedicating their resources toward it, then there's that inherent disincentive to pursue these types of programs. And Mark, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, so I think on the first point, the benefit for ratepayers is clear in our case, where even if the program had a net benefit of zero when compared to a traditional solution, ratepayers would be essentially harmless. Rates wouldn't really increase as a result of the program. But what we're seeing is that there's a significant benefit, and that ratepayers are going to be obtaining 70% of those benefits, which is really an excellent situation for all of our utility customers. And additionally, with Central Hudson having a new earnings opportunity, we realize that our business model is changing and needs to be flexible with all of these new REV initiatives going on. So we're really excited to find this new earnings opportunity within a non-wires alternative.
Okay, great. And I'm going to combine kind of two questions here. So what are your views on allowing transmission and distribution companies to earn a rate of return on service contracts that meet criteria such as deferment of capital expenditures? And also, should RTOs take a more active role in promoting non-wires alternatives? And I think both of you can speak to this.
Well, sure. I'll go ahead and go first on that. I think for the first question, yes, I think that as long as the investment is past the prudency test, then T&D companies should be able to earn a rate of return on this type of investment. But then we get into that means that we need to get into questions about the amortization schedule and the expected life of the program, if you will. For those investments. There's some accounting questions behind it, but as a general question, yes. For the RTO question, that's tough. Like I pointed out in my comments, when you go to a sub-zonal level, most of the RTOs out there have not spent the resources on looking at the value beyond the zonal level. So they would have to do that. That would require additional time. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's certainly possible, but it would take resources. The problem with most RTOs right now is that their tariffs are, even those that are ostensibly supposed to support demand response in their capacity markets, their tariffs largely are set up to support generation. So I think that we need to have a bigger policy discussion at the RTO level to get that ship moving in the right direction again.
Mark, do you have any commentary?
Actually, Elta, I'm going to skip that one because it's a little bit outside my area of expertise.
Okay, that's all right. So, Mark, just as a question to you then, would CenHub have deployed this program without REV? If not, what else would have encouraged an NWA within your territory?
I think that's hard to say, but there's a good chance that we would have. There's a lot of new things happening with REV, such as Send Hub, our new online portal that customers can communicate and engage with us. And a lot of these things are things that we were interested in doing anyway, and now we're happy to be doing them now that the framework exists to sort of facilitate that. So what I would say is we probably would have sought out this additional earnings opportunity as long as the regulatory framework existed to enable us to do so.
Great. And I think this is a good follow-up question here from Matt. What is the vendor perspective on things utilities can start doing today to improve and streamline the NWA procurement process?
Well, I think that taking leadership if it's a municipality taking leadership just in-house or a co-op, but if it's a regulated utility, then taking leadership at the commission in a non-adversarial setting, so certainly outside of rate case, for example, and starting to present. I talked about distribution system implementation plans, but starting to present that possibility to staff and to commissioners as something that they're willing to do and something that's easily implementable, just like they've done in New York as part of REV. Certainly, it's certainly not. It's only one component of the REV policy in New York. And like I said, it's something that's replicable, and it's also something that the utilities can carry on their own to a commission. But just generally, and promoting a DSIP is just generally, I think that talking about the viability of these programs versus traditional infrastructure investment is a great first step. And if they need help with some of the details on that, Converge is is very glad to help, rather.
And just to add to that point about procurement, the utilities in New York State have been working together throughout the past year on DER sourcing and trying to standardize and streamline where possible. We've done a lot of stakeholder engagement with DER providers and others acting in the market just to try to understand what the needs are, how we can improve. Most of the utilities in New York are still fairly new to this, so there's always areas to improve, and there's a lot of results that we found and action items going forward that we included in our supplemental DSIP filing.
Okay, great. And Mark, I have a question here on more of the specifics for you. What are the measurement and verification techniques used to determine the kilowatt reduction of customers?
So that's a good question. We do that in a number of different ways, and it differs by population. So for thermostat customers, we have real-time two-way telemetry with the thermostat. So what we're actually doing is developing a CBL based on each individual customer's usage level in the days preceding an event. We use the best 5 of previous 10 days that match the event day in a number of criteria. And then we compare the event usage to what that customer base load would have been. In the case of DLC switches, we don't have two-way communication with those. So what we're doing is we're actually combining this program with another new initiative called Insights Plus. It's essentially a smart meter opt-in program. So we're offering that program to customers who have DLC switches, and we're using that smart meter data to essentially do the same thing because we don't have full smart meter deployment in our service territory. Then on the large C&I side, all of the customers that are participating in the program have interval meters currently installed through our hourly pricing provision program, and we're using that data to create a CBL for those customers and calculate what the reductions were.
Great. And, in the future, do you plan on relying on an AMI for measurement and verification? Is this something that's in the works?
Not at this time. So we've looked at an AMI rollout for our service territory. We do not think it's cost effective at this time. So that's why instead we're offering the Insights Plus program, which essentially is going to test the market to see if customers are willing to pay a small nominal fee for the additional benefits and information that they'll get from having a smart meter installed. Now, I should say the customers that are in the Targeted Demand Response Program do not have to pay a fee. They're offered this as a free service because it's benefiting us in terms of getting our M&V data that we need.
Great. And, I think one of the main questions, the overarching questions that comes up is kind of the trust in having residential demand response for this non-wireless alternative. And, of course, what kilowatt reduction are you getting per residential customer?
So what we have now are preliminary results, and it varies by group. And depending on the event day and the customer population that we're looking at, we're seeing anywhere from 0.9 kW per customer to 2 kW per customer. And there's a lot of factors that play into that: the ambient temperature, the humidity, and also because we're using a CBL method, the weather and the cooling behavior of the system in the days preceding an event also impacts what that effective reduction is going to be.
Great. And what about penalties for noncompliance? How do they differ between the mix of customers, if there are any, of course?
So for large C&I customers, it's very simple. They're paid on a performance basis. So for them to be paid for their participation in the program, they have to show consistent performance throughout all the events that we have in the summer. And they're assigned a performance factor for each season that determines what their compensation is. Now, for residential, it's a little more tricky. We're not expecting a specific performance level from every thermostat in every event. We do allow some overrides, up to 2 per year, and customers can override 2 events per year without having it affect their annual compensation of $50 at all. And what we found so far is that the override rate is very, very low. Most customers either don't notice an event, aren't interested enough to override, and they just kind of wait it out.
And, Mark, a lot of questions are coming in for you here because this is, one of the few non-wireless alternatives programs. And, what are you taking any other measures besides your contract with Converge to address the non-wireless alternatives? And of course, how by relying on one party, are you worried about a concentration risk?
So what we've done in this instance, since we had a quick rollout, we knew we had aggressive targets, we are using one provider. We're using Converge's solution to meet all the needs of those areas. We needed a quick deployment, we needed a commitment, and in turn, we provided exclusivity to these 3 areas. Now, for future, and I should say that, we're encouraged by the fact that we're on target to meet our planning milestones based on the performance so far. We still have a long road ahead to reach 16 megawatts, but I think that we'll continue to recruit customers and increase the amount of penetration in the program. We have identified one potential additional area over in Orange County on the other side of the river from our Fishkill area, and that is something that we will potentially look for other solutions, whether to use it to test out a pilot program, or we could theoretically expand the Targeted Demand Response Program there if it's going very well. But I think that's yet to be determined how we would meet that need.
Great. And I have a question here that maybe you can both answer. What does this process look like of, the utility working with Converge to bring this program to fruition and, get it off the ground? So maybe both of you can speak to the experience and, of course, the advantages of using a third party.
Well, I can just say that, using a third party has been very advantageous to us. We've been in business for a long time. Central Hudson's been around for over 100 years. So we have a lot of experience in the traditional utility projects. We've been doing aggressive energy efficiency programs for about 8 years, but we really don't have much experience with demand response. This is a new frontier for us. So that third-party expertise is extremely valuable to us, as well as the resources. when we began working with Converge, we got a full team dedicated to this project, and we got an extremely quick rollout of the program, which is what we needed. And it would have been much more challenging for us to do that internally.
Yeah, and just from our perspective, this differs from our traditional demand response programs and the ones that we've been doing for going back almost 3 decades, because it's targeted specifically at one area, and it's not a system-wide deployment. Now, one of our differentiators is that we have techs in the field. We roll trucks and work as agents of the utility in most of our deployments. But we were able to bring that to the table. Plus, we have relationships with other energy management providers that were necessary for providing this kind of targeted solution. So, for the C&I customers, we brought in C-Power since Converge is focused on the mass market. We brought in other providers to help us with targeted energy efficiency tips, and the list goes on. There are a number of partners that we brought in and manage for Central Hudson in this program. So, like I said before, it's a complex. These programs are complex, and there are a lot of moving parts. And it's really been very rewarding for us as a company.
And I think this is something you can both speak to as well. Which types of capital investments are best suited for an on-wires alternative deferral, and which are at least, because it's not a one-size-fits-all type of solution, right? And so I think that'd be nice to provide some commentary on that.
What we've found in our experience is that the best fit for non-wires alternative is growth-based infrastructure projects. And as I mentioned in the presentation, that's about 5% of our capital budget. So there's a whole slew of other things, and I think it's consistent with other utilities in New York State and in the Northeast. A lot of our capital budget is going to repair and replacement. So when we replace systems that are already in place, we're not necessarily increasing the capacity, or if we are, there's only an incremental cost to do so. So those are probably not good fits for non-wires alternative, since we have to at least maintain the existing service level that we have. And that's why we seek out these areas of growth that we can really avoid the capacity that we're forecasting to occur and avoid potentially building new infrastructure to meet those needs.
And I would say that our perspective aligns directly with that, and that's why I mentioned the population growth dynamics in this country earlier when I was setting up my comments. We've seen these areas of higher growth in population to be kind of a proxy for demand growth, but it's this demand growth that's requiring either additional infrastructure investment, or for the utility to seek something like a non-wire alternative.
Great. And we have a question here coming in saying, are generating assets like those within a microgrid that relieve pressure on the distribution grid considered as part of a non-wires alternative, or is it something that's, designed specific to a utility solution that's needed?
So from our perspective, I think theoretically those kinds of solutions could work. And part of the reason that we didn't go with something large scale for this was there were a couple of reasons for that. One is we wanted to engage customers. So we did look at storage and generation, but we looked at it behind the meter, trying to get customers involved, trying to see how the market would react when we try to involve customers in these programs. And one of the other key things to keep in mind that the larger scale projects tend to need a longer contract, if you will, to make them viable. So what we're doing right now, this program runs through 2019, and then after 2019 we'll reassess. And I think that for such a short time frame to do community generation or some other large-scale project, it might need a longer time frame to be cost-effective.
And from my perspective, I like I said, I think that when you're looking at an alternative to traditional investment, the best thing to do to decide on your objectives if you're the utility or if you're the commission or a combination of the two. And then let the ideas come in, and if it's a cost-effective solution that provides the most benefit and things, let's not overlook benefits like customer engagement and the interaction between the utility and the customer. Then they can be evaluated on their merits and on a side-by-side basis. But yes, I think that it's an interesting future that we're facing, and we'll certainly see things like storage and microgrids be part of these solutions going forward.
And another aspect of that in New York State is the BCA handbook that the utilities jointly created. And really what that intends to do is to standardize the approach of evaluating the benefit cost of these types of projects. So it gives the market a little bit more stability and understanding of how these things are going to be evaluated. And that standardization is going to help us allow different types of technologies to act in the market.
Wonderful. Thank you guys for your commentary. So in closing, I'd like to note that we'll archive this webinar at greentechmedia.com for 3 months. And I'd also like to thank our speakers today, and thank you to all of you for listening.